Before you immerse yourself in tonight's terror, hit that subscribe button if you think you can handle even darker stories lurking in the shadows. I never thought I'd end up as a night security guard at a mall, but here we are. The job came out of nowhere, honestly. It seemed too good to be true, high pay for the kind of hours I'd be working. Sure, I was desperate, drowning in debt, but the more I thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. The hours were odd, sure, but maybe that's why they were paying so well. I figured I could deal with it. Plus, the mall was brand new, so it wasn't like there'd be too much to worry about, right? The first night I walked in, though, there was something off about the place. It wasn't just the fact that it was dead quiet. No customers, no employees, no noise, except for the hum of the lights overhead. It felt heavy, like the air was thick and pressing against me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move in ways they shouldn't, stretching and shifting, even though I was sure I was the only one there. They handed me a folder with a list of rules. The manager was all smiles, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my stomach as I read through them. They were bizarre, honestly. I thought they might be a joke at first, but the manager's serious tone made it clear they weren't. I didn't question it, though. The pay was good. They were a little weird, yeah, but I figured I could handle it. I had to. So here were the rules. Rule 1, do not enter any store offering a final sale after midnight. Rule 2, if you find a shopping bag on the floor, leave it there. It's not yours. Rule 3, when the intercom says clean up on aisle 5, do not go to aisle 5. Rule 4, every night, check the toy store for missing inventory. If you find something on the shelf that shouldn't be there, report it. Rule 5, if a customer asks for help, pretend you don't see them. They're not real. I remember reading through them, a little confused by some of the wording. Not real? What did that even mean? But I didn't ask. I just nodded along, thinking I'd figure it all out as I went. After all, it was just a job, right? The first night passed without much incident. I did my rounds, checked the empty stores, walked past the food court, and patrolled the long corridors. The whole place felt like it had been frozen in time. It was eerie, like everything was waiting for something, but I couldn't put my finger on what. But then I started noticing things. Little things. The way the lights flickered every so often, not enough to be a malfunction, but enough to make me pause. The way the air would grow colder in certain sections, and how the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. I shrugged it off. It was just the weirdness of working the night shift in a huge empty mall. I hadn't even been working there for a week before I realized something else. I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything obvious, no people jumping out at me or anything like that, but I could feel it, the sense that something wasn't right. The mall felt like it was alive in a way I couldn't explain. Every step I took, every corner I rounded, the feeling grew stronger. And those rules, they started to feel less like guidelines and more like warnings. I didn't break any of the rules, though. Not at first. The truth is, I was scared to. And maybe that's why I kept following them. They didn't make sense, but I wasn't about to risk finding out what happened if I ignored them. The second night started off pretty much like the first one. I showed up a little early, not wanting to miss anything, and made my way to the security office to get settled in. The mall was as quiet as it always was at that hour, with no customers, no sounds of the usual bustle. It almost felt like I was walking through an abandoned building, just me, the lights, and the closed stores. I decided to start with the usual rounds, checking the locks on the doors, making sure everything was secure. It was a routine I had gotten used to in just 2 nights. As I walked past one of the store windows, I noticed something that caught my eye. It wasn't the store itself or anything inside. It was my reflection in the glass. I stood still for a moment, staring at it. At first, everything seemed fine, but then I realized something odd. My reflection wasn't moving in sync with me. I lifted my hand, and my reflection stayed frozen, its grin wide, too wide, like it was trying too hard to smile. I turned around to check behind me, expecting to find someone else in the hall, maybe a cleaning crew or a late-night shopper. But there was no one, just an empty mall, the overhead lights casting long shadows. I turned back to the window, half expecting the reflection to change, to look normal again. But it didn't. It was still there, standing still, grinning at me, I could feel my chest tighten as I stared at it, unsure of what to make of it. It was almost like the reflection was aware of me, watching me, waiting for something. Without thinking much about it, I backed away from the window and continued my rounds. I tried to focus on the task at hand, checking the stores, making sure all the lights were working, and taking note of anything unusual. But my mind kept drifting back to what I had seen in that window. I shook it off. It had to have been a trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired, or my eyes were playing tricks on me. The lighting in the mall was dim, and the glass was probably dirty. Nothing to worry about. I didn't think too much more of it until later that night. I was sitting in the security office, going through the usual routine of monitoring the cameras, making sure there were no problems. The mall was still dead quiet. I kept glancing up at the screens, just checking in on the different areas. That's when I saw it again. There, on the monitor, was the same reflection, but this time it wasn't in a store window. It was in the security footage. It was standing behind me, my reflection, grinning again. I didn't even have to look at myself to know I wasn't standing there. I was seated at the desk, looking at the screens. My reflection, however, was in a different position. It was like it was waiting for me to notice. I spun around in my chair, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. Just the usual empty office, the hum of the computer, the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. I turned back to the monitor, my heart skipping a beat as I stared at the screen. The reflection was still there just as before. It was too still, too deliberate. I sat there for a long moment, unsure of what to think. Was this some kind of glitch in the system? Maybe the cameras were malfunctioning, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something about it felt wrong, more like a message or a sign. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the image from my head, but it stayed there, in the back of my mind, like it was waiting to tell me something. Something I wasn't supposed to know. The next night, I was starting to feel like I was getting used to the routine. The mall was as quiet as ever, with nothing out of the ordinary. Well, nothing too strange. I was walking down one of the long hallways when I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was faint at first, like someone had left a radio on in the distance. A soft, almost nostalgic tune floating through the air. I glanced around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The source seemed clear, the elevator. It shouldn't have been on. I knew that for sure because the mall had a policy of turning off all non-essential services after hours. The elevator was one of those things that was supposed to stay inactive during the night shift. But here it was, the faint music playing from inside it, as if it had a mind of its own. I walked up to the elevator, half expecting it to open automatically, but it didn't. I pressed the button, and after a moment, the doors slid open with a soft, nearly silent ding. The inside was lit up as if it were the middle of the day. It was too bright for that time of night. The lights inside glowed warmly, and there, right in front of me, was a fully stocked department store, completely unexpected. The store shelves were lined with products, brand new, neatly arranged, some items I had never seen before. Everything had a fresh, untouched look, like it had just been restocked. A bright, bold final sale banner stretched across the entrance, catching my eye. The kind of thing you'd expect to see during the busiest hours of a mall, not at 3 in the morning. I hesitated for a moment. This wasn't right. I hadn't seen this store before, and the elevator definitely didn't go to this floor. But curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped into the elevator, crossing the threshold into the store. The moment I did, the lights flickered. Just a quick flash, and then everything went dark for a split second. When the lights came back on, the store had changed. Everything was different. The shelves, once neatly stocked, were now empty. The walls were bare, and the space felt off, like I had stepped into a place that didn't belong. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The elevator doors that had once opened smoothly now seemed to be closing slower, almost reluctantly. I turned to leave, but as I did, I felt a chill in the air, something cold that shouldn't have been there. That's when I saw it. A hand. No, it wasn't really a hand, not in any normal sense, reached out from the darkness, from where the store's shelves had once been, its fingers long and unnaturally thin. It stretched forward, impossibly fast, and it was just inches from grabbing my arm. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding it. I could feel the coldness from where the hand had come from, a coldness that seemed to seep through the air. The elevator doors were almost closed now, but I dove for them, heart pounding, barely making it inside before they shut completely. The music stopped as the doors closed, and I found myself back in the dimly lit hallway of the mall, the familiar, sterile silence surrounding me again. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation. The elevator should not have been operating, and that store wasn't supposed to be there. I could still feel the cold from the hand on my skin like it had left a mark. I tried to push it out of my mind. There had to be a rational explanation, right? Maybe it was just a malfunction with the elevator system. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something had changed. By the time I got to the toy store later that night, I was starting to feel the weight of the hours. The mall was quieter than usual, and the only sound I could hear was the faint shuffle of my shoes against the linoleum floors. The toy store was usually one of the more lively areas during the day, full of parents dragging their kids around and the occasional teen grabbing something off the shelf. But at night, it felt empty, as if the toys themselves were waiting for something to happen. I was there to check inventory, just like I had every night. It was part of the job, one of those rules that didn't make much sense, but I followed them anyway. Rule number 4, every night check the toy store for missing inventory. Simple enough. The store was dark except for the flickering overhead lights and the dim emergency lights along the walls. The aisles stretched out in front of me, filled with rows of neatly organized shelves. But tonight, something felt different. My flashlight swept across the store, illuminating the rows of plush toys and action figures, but my eyes kept catching something in the distance. It was sitting in the center of the aisle, right in front of a shelf full of stuffed animals. A new doll. It was small, not much bigger than a hand, and it was placed carefully in the middle of the path. The tag on it read, "Special Order." I frowned, never having seen it before. It wasn't the kind of thing that just showed up in a store like this. I set my flashlight down on the shelf next to me and bent down to take a closer look. The doll's face was unsettling. It wasn't like any other doll I'd seen before. Its porcelain features were cracked in places, and its eyes, dark and lifeless, seemed to stare right through me. The worst part, though, the part that made my stomach twist, was how familiar its face looked. It was like looking into a mirror, but twisted. The features were slightly off, the eyes too wide, the mouth stretched into a faint, unsettling smile. I reached out, drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. As my fingers brushed against its cold surface, something happened. The doll's head jerked to the side, its eyes focusing on me, and it whispered, "You broke it. Now they'll take you too." I froze, my hand still hovering over it. The voice was soft, almost like a breath against my ear, but there was no one else around. I looked around quickly, but the store was as silent as it had been before. I pulled my hand back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the doll. It felt like I was trapped in its gaze. Then, before I could even stand up, the lights overhead flickered, and the room around me seemed to twist. The shelves, once neatly arranged with toys, were now completely different. The aisles were filled with hundreds of identical dolls, all of them sitting perfectly still, staring right at me with those same empty eyes. Their faces were all the same. The one I held in my hand, the one that had whispered to me, was now part of a sea of identical figures, each one more unnerving than the last. I stepped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to figure out where they'd come from. The aisle seemed endless now, stretching on in every direction, filled with these dolls. It was like I was surrounded by them, trapped in a never-ending sea of porcelain and glass. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I backed away, the doll's eyes following me, unmoving, but I could swear I felt their gaze. I ran my fingers along the shelf, trying to steady myself, but the more I backed away, the more the dolls seemed to multiply. Just as I was about to turn and leave, a loud crack echoed through the store, the sound of porcelain shattering. I spun around, but the dolls hadn't moved. No, it wasn't the dolls. It was one of the shelves behind me, the wood splintering like it had been cracked open from the inside. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned on my heel and bolted for the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The toy store was behind me now, but I didn't feel safe. The dolls were still there, in my mind, their eyes boring into me, even as I left the store and made my way down the hall. What had I just seen? What was that thing? I couldn't shake the feeling that the dolls were alive somehow, watching me. They weren't just toys anymore. They were something else. I needed to get out of there, but I knew that it wouldn't be that easy. It never was. It was the middle of my shift when I heard the announcement. The intercom crackled with that same unremarkable voice, just like it had every other night. "Clean up on aisle 5. I froze. My mind immediately went to Rule 3. I'd learned it the hard way. Do not go to aisle 5. It was one of the first things they'd told me when I started. But why did the intercom say it? The message didn't make sense. I had walked through aisle 5 just last night, and it had been perfectly fine. No mess, no need for cleaning. Was this just some weird glitch, or was there something more to it? I stood there for a moment, staring at the security monitor, trying to come up with a rational explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more the rules seemed to weigh on me. The rules were the only thing keeping me from ending up like the other guards who had quit after a week. The rumors about this place were enough to make anyone jump ship. I had to follow them, no exceptions. But then again, why was this rule in place? What was so dangerous about aisle 5? I paced back and forth, my mind spinning. It seemed silly to be this cautious, but after everything that had happened so far, I didn't want to risk it. But the intercom had called out for cleanup. Cleanup. That was a direct order, right? I bit my lip, still unsure. The rules had been clear. And yet, something inside me told me I should go check it out. I don't know if it was the fact that I'd been here for so long and still didn't know the full story, or if it was just the creeping curiosity that had been building since my first night. But whatever it was, it got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and made my way toward aisle 5. My footsteps echoed in the empty hall, and I tried to shake off the sensation that something was watching me. I walked quickly but with purpose, trying to keep my head clear. The closer I got, the more I noticed how quiet the mall was. Even the usual hum of the ventilation system seemed absent. When I reached the spot where aisle 5 should have been, I stopped. There was nothing there. Just a blank, unmarked wall. I blinked. No shelves, no products, nothing. It looked like it had always been just a wall, as if aisle 5 had never existed. My heart beat a little faster. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it all. The intercom had said aisle 5. The wall was supposed to be there, but nothing. Nothing made sense. Then I heard it. Soft, muffled, dragging footsteps. The sound was faint, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. It was coming from the other side of the wall. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with thoughts of the rules. Do not go to aisle 5. And yet here I was. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The dragging continued, slow and deliberate. The sound of something heavy scraping against the floor. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't look away. The whispers came next, faint, unintelligible murmurs. I tried to make them out, but they were too far off to hear clearly. I moved closer to the wall, almost on instinct. My flashlight flickered, the beam jumping erratically as I shone it at the wall. There was nothing there. No cracks, no signs of any disturbance. It looked just as smooth as before. And then, without warning, the wall cracked. A thin line appeared in the middle of the surface, as if something was trying to break through. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight shook in my hand, the crack widened slowly, and I saw it. An eye. It was bloodshot, veined, and bulging. The eye stared at me, unmoving, but not unfeeling. It was like it had been watching me for ages, waiting for me to find it. The eye didn't blink. It didn't even seem to shift. It just stared. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. That horrible gaze seemed to pierce right through me. Time felt like it stopped. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away. The wall sealed itself back up just as quickly as it had cracked. The eye vanished. The dragging footsteps stopped. The whispers died. I stood there for a long time, trembling, my heart thumping in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The wall was smooth again, no signs of anything unusual, but I knew what I'd seen. And it wasn't just my imagination. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I first heard it. A frantic banging echoed through the empty mall, sharp and desperate. At first, I figured it was a malfunction. Maybe some equipment was off balance, knocking against the walls. But then came the voice. "Please, please let me out! They're coming! Please, you have to help me!" The voice was high-pitched, full of terror. I froze, my fingers tightening on the flashlight I was holding. The sound was coming from one of the storefronts. I quickly glanced at the security monitors, my eyes scanning the mall layout. The source of the noise came from a small clothing boutique, one that had been locked up for the night. I wasn't supposed to engage with anyone. Rule 5 was clear. If a customer asks for help, pretend you don't see them. They're not real. That rule had been drilled into me since day one, but this felt different. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but the woman's voice was too frantic to ignore. "Please, I'm bleeding. They won't stop coming. I'm trapped in here." She screamed, her voice cracking as she pounded on the glass door. "You have to help me. I'll die if you don't." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the raw fear. She wasn't just asking for help. She was begging for her life. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, torn between what I knew I should do and what felt like the right thing to do. The woman's cries grew louder, and when I peered through the glass, I saw something that made my stomach lurch. A streak of blood smeared across the storefront window. It was fresh, oozing from her hand as she pressed it against the glass, her fingers trembling. She pulled away and stumbled back, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She was genuinely terrified. I could see the blood on her hands, the marks from where she'd tried to scratch at the door, trying to escape. Her clothes were torn, and she looked like she hadn't eaten or slept in days. There was no mistaking it. Whatever was happening to her was real. "Please, you don't understand," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "They're coming for me. They won't stop. You have to let me out, or I'll be dead by morning." I stepped back, my mind racing. I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't leave her there, dying. The blood was real. The fear in her eyes was real. She was real. My hand hovered over the lock of the door. The rules were clear. I wasn't supposed to open the door. I wasn't supposed to even acknowledge her. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing, what I was hearing. I couldn't just pretend she wasn't there. My heart hammered in my chest as I unlocked the door. The woman's eyes widened in relief, and she rushed forward, pressing her palm against the glass as she begged. "Thank you. Thank you so much. Please hurry. They're right behind me." I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. As soon as the door clicked open, the woman hurriedly stumbled out, her hands reaching for me, her face filled with raw fear. I barely had a moment to process what was happening before something even worse came into view. From the dark corners behind her, a massive figure slowly began to emerge, its shape barely discernible in the dim light, but those glowing red eyes, they couldn't be ignored. They burned with an intensity that stopped me in my tracks, focusing directly on me with a chilling, unrelenting gaze. I was frozen, unable to move or even breathe properly. This wasn't some trick of the mind. It wasn't a hallucination. This monstrous figure was so real and so close that I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of it pressing in on me. The woman, still holding onto my arm desperately, kept pulling me further away from the dark mass. I wasn't sure if she was trying to protect me or if she was simply trying to escape herself. But in that moment, all of my thoughts spiraled in confusion as the thing behind her stretched its limbs unnaturally, growing taller and taller, each movement slow yet filled with a disturbing grace. The shadows seemed to bend and ripple as it rose, its form distorting almost as if it wasn't entirely bound by the rules of the physical world. The sound of claws scraping along the floor was loud and haunting, the noise echoing through the otherwise silent mall. I could feel the force of its presence, something so dark and primal that it made my instincts scream to run, to get away. The woman's grip on my arm tightened further as she pulled me back, her breath fast and shallow. She wasn't screaming or pleading in the same way I had expected. It wasn't desperation to survive alone. She was terrified, Yes, but it was clear she had no idea what was happening. She had no connection to the rules that had been set in place for the mall. She didn't know the creature that haunted it. She was simply another victim, just like me. I began to realize the horrifying truth. I had broken the rules. I didn't know exactly what the consequences would be, but now I was witnessing them firsthand. The woman wasn't some entity. She wasn't part of the system. She was a real person, and her presence here had confirmed something that had been lodged in the back of my mind all along. The rules had never been about protecting us. They were a method of keeping the creature contained, ensuring it only claimed one victim at a time. By breaking Rule 5, I had unintentionally made myself part of the equation. As I looked back at the creature, I could see its sharp, glowing eyes still fixed on me, unwavering. The woman, still shaking, pressed herself close, but it didn't seem to matter. We were both trapped here now. I could feel the weight of the situation crashing over me. There was no escape, not for me, not for her. No matter how much I wanted to run, I knew it was too late. The thing wasn't just a monster. It was part of something far bigger than I could comprehend. There was no one here to save us. We had both become part of the mall's curse. In that brief moment, with the figure towering over us, I understood the terrible truth. The creature didn't want her, and now it didn't want me. It simply wanted what we had become, tools of its game. And the price for breaking the rules wasn't just freedom, it was a life, and I had unwittingly offered mine. I knew the moment I tried to move that the creature was closer. Every step I took, every desperate pull of the woman's hand only seemed to fuel its pursuit. It was relentless, like it was always one step ahead, always waiting for me to make the next mistake. "Come on," I shouted, my voice strained as I yanked the woman along with me. She stumbled, barely keeping up, but the terror in her eyes kept her moving. The exit doors were in sight, the promise of freedom, or at least something resembling it. With every ounce of strength left in me, I rushed toward them, praying that we could make it, praying that the nightmare would end. But just as we reached the threshold, something stopped me cold. A shopping bag sat in the middle of the floor, right in front of the exit. I didn't even have to look at it closely to know something was wrong. The bag was unnaturally pristine, not a crease or a wrinkle, the label staring back at me with unnerving precision. My name. I didn't want to look inside, but I did. Inside the bag was a folded uniform, the same one the other security guards wore, and tucked beneath it, a receipt. The numbers on it didn't make sense, but the word at the top was unmistakable. Sold. Before I could process what I was seeing, the woman beside me let out a strangled cry and vanished into thin air, as if she'd never been there at all. I reached out to her, but I could feel the air around me shift in an instant, pulling me backward, the shadows tightening like a vice. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fight it. Unseen hands gripped me, pulling me back into the darkness, and I was dragged into the same black void the creature had come from. No matter how hard I struggled, no matter how loudly I screamed, there was nothing but the cold, suffocating grip of the shadows. Then everything went still. The next shift began as any other. Another security guard, fresh-faced and eager, arrived at the mall. The doors creaked open, and the lights flickered to life, casting their harsh, fluorescent glow on the empty hallways. As he made his rounds, checking the stores, he found something in the toy store. A mannequin stood in the center of the aisle, its features eerily familiar. It was dressed in the same uniform as every other security guard in the mall, but something about it felt wrong, unnerving. The mannequin's face was blank, but its eyes were fixed on him, and in its hands it held a sign that read, "Final Sale." The new guard stared at it for a long moment, the words lingering in his mind as the faintest echo of a voice whispered through the air. "Don't open the door." Thanks for watching. If you're craving more spine-chilling stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more nightmares.